Much of the world's attention has been on the long-awaited release of hostages held captive by Hamas. There were other developments that deserve attention as well, from church crackdowns in China to the assault on parental rights in California. So here to discuss them with me is our panel for today, Travis Weber, Vice President for Policy and Government Affairs, and Casey Harper, Managing Editor for Broadcast at the Washington Stand. Travis, Casey, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Tony.
All right, obviously the big news out of the Middle East. Casey, we've discussed this at the top of the program, but I want to go beyond the headlines. Now, we're thrilled about the hostages. I've met with many of the hostage families and with some of the hostages that have been released. In fact, we've hosted some here at FRC. But beyond the celebration, there is still a lot to do. Now, it's clear that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu understands this, because in a televised address last night, he said, quote, "The campaign is not over," warning that Israel still faces very big security challenges. He said some adversaries are trying to recover to attack us again. So how are those comments being interpreted in the wake of the hostage release?
Yeah, well, Tony, I'm raising some eyebrows for sure. And I think there's honestly a little bit of confusion right now where we're asking the question, how does what Netanyahu is saying line up with President Trump? And I think it reflects some behind the scenes ongoing dialogue and tension between the U.S. and Israel, not fighting, but tension between what are the details, the devil's always in the details of this peace plan. What's it actually going to look like as it works out? Of course, famously, Hamas did not agree to the full peace plan. They only agreed to part of it. And there was an Axios report that the White House denied about a conversation between Netanyahu and President Trump where they sort of had a spat where President Trump was frustrated that Netanyahu wasn't more excited about the partial acceptance of this peace plan. And so the hostages coming back is great. Of course, President Trump is spiking the football, and Netanyahu has sort of come around in his public rhetoric saying this is good, that there is going to be peace. And he used the word hopefully will be peace for years to come. And I think that's pretty reflective of where Israel is right now. Hopefully, this is going to work out well.
Travis, of the stated war goals that Israel had in this war with Hamas, number one was to get the hostages back. That's now happened. At least the live hostages are back. Second was to eliminate Hamas and ensure that Gaza was not under the control of the Islamists any longer. What we've seen, reports today, Hamas has started deploying armed fighters and police across parts of Gaza as Israel withdraws. And this is an attempt to apparently reassert authority in devastated areas of the territory.
Yeah, no, exactly that. So if the goal is to not have them exert control, it is, I would argue, one of the definitions. It's part of the definition of control to have armed men on the streets giving orders and backing up those orders with the force of weaponry and lethal force. So by that definition, they're in control of parts of it. And there appears to be a struggle for control, perhaps in other parts. But that should remind us all that, when Israel is withdrawing, they're leaving a vacuum. And into that vacuum swept Hamas 20 years ago, and they're now sweeping into it once again.
But is this possibly, the first step on a multi-step journey? I mean, it's got to start somewhere, and we certainly applaud the work that the president has done. But there were some other disturbing developments as the president left to go to Egypt for a summit of all of the Islamic partners, all the Arab partners here, being hosted by President El-Sisi of Egypt. Last minute, this is according to news reports, last minute reports was that the president wanted Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to attend, but he was prevented from attending because of objections by Turkey's President Erdogan. Travis?
Yeah, I mean, Tony, this is disturbing because on the face of it, if you look at that table today, you had Trump in the United States, then along with Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey at the prominent seats on that table, purportedly to broker a peace between Israel and Hamas. So that would assume a neutral arbiter. So why would a neutral arbiter refuse the presence of one of the parties for which they are supposedly playing arbiter and mediating the peace? Doesn't make any sense. Only makes sense if they're not actually a neutral arbiter, they're not a neutral mediator, and they desire to put their finger on the lever of this scale in some direction. And we have plenty of evidence of that in other regard, that Turkey and Qatar were aligned with Hamas than being a neutral mediator in this case.
I want to play a clip of the president. He spoke before the Knesset this morning, our time. And I want to play clip number 3.
This is not only the end of a war. This is the end of an age of terror and death and the beginning of the age of faith and hope and of God. It's the start of a grand concord and lasting harmony for Israel and all the nations of what will soon be a truly magnificent region.
All right, Travis, I'll give you the first crack at that. What your thoughts?
Tony, I think we all wish for that to be true, but we can't say it's true when we have obvious challenges to deal with, notably Hamas's refusal to really comply with the conditions and the spirit behind the conditions of this supposed peace. And so we must address those and recognize, as the president is doing in a larger sense, that God is the only one who can really, truly ever bring total peace to that region. And Tony, I'll just say, of course, we're celebrating the fact that the hostages have returned, absolutely. But there were 3 lawmakers, at least, members of the Knesset, who protested President Trump's speech there today and did not attend because they feel so strongly that this will not bring peace, and they feel so strongly that this is allowing Hamas to remain, to rearm, and to bring future carnage and death to those in Gaza and Israel alike.
Casey?
Yeah, well, clearly President Trump he's putting this in grand terms, talking about an age. And he says at one point in his speech, he said, it took 3,000 years to get this. Who would have thought that I could have done it? And so he's seeing this as a literally historic deal. I mean, I think people have been in this part of the world, people like Netanyahu for a long time, are probably more pessimistic because they know about the deep-seated hatred for Israel in places like Turkey, but of course not reserved for Turkey. And so he's marking this as historic. I think there's a problem, though, Tony, and this could be an interesting question for you, which is if Hamas violates this deal in it more than they seem like they already might be about to do, and then Israel goes back in militarily, I think it's setting Israel up potentially to look like they're the ones who violated a peace deal that everyone else was on board with. And so it could be setting up a situation where Israel either has to not respond to Hamas's violation of the deal or risk losing even more international support and being blamed for the start of a new war.
I think this does increase the pressure on Israel. But there's also a reality there post October the 7th that what Benjamin Netanyahu described as untenable is untenable to the Israeli people. They cannot live with this risk on their border. Now, I applaud President Trump in his efforts, but I do think we have to be realistic. I mean, Scripture makes very clear that true and lasting peace will only come when the Prince of Peace reigns. Now, that does not mean we wash our hands of responsibility. I think until that day comes, we are called to pursue a managed peace. All right, I believe we need to try to get peace in the world, but that has to be grounded in strength, guided by truth, anchored in biblical reality. And I think, as you pointed to, Casey, the history there is very important. It is not just a geopolitical conflict. It is a spiritual conflict as well. Again, that does not mean that we should be settled or we should settle for perpetual conflict. Not at all. But we need to pray into this. And so I know we're going to move on to another topic, but I just want to challenge our viewers and listeners to be praying for the peace of Jerusalem, the peace of Israel. And that encompasses all the people, the Palestinians, the Arabs, the Israelis. Peace will be good for everyone. And so we need to pray and work to that end, but anchored in biblical reality. All right, speaking of peace, there's not a lot of peace in China if you're a Christian. Travis, speak to what happened over the weekend.
Yeah, so there appears to have been a coordinated, widespread crackdown on the underground Christian church that has been launched by the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese authorities. This appears to have started with Zion Church Network, a large influential underground church network who some folks might remember during COVID stood up against the government there. So they're an influential, important network. Pastors in multiple cities in a coordinated crackdown, detained and taken away at the same time. Sometimes churches raided during the services as they took place. In one instance, mother was breastfeeding her child, and they were taken in together, and then another family member was called to take the child home from the police station. So this is disrupting churches, the leadership in those churches, pastors, the cohesion of families, and those bodies of the local bodies of Christ in those places. Now, this crackdown appears to have been now spread at the direction, of the government there. They're extending it to other underground church networks. So very significant. Our friend Bob Fu, who's a senior fellow with Family Research Council, in addition to founder and president of China Aid, is saying this is the most significant crackdown he is seeing in 4 decades. And that's significant because he's tracking these issues almost daily. And so he's saying this is really significant coming at this time, right, as the world's attention is focused on the release of the hostages, yet forces of evil at operation in authoritarian coercive regimes like the CCP are exerting their power and influence to detain God's people. And so this is a call to prayer for these detained believers, fellow believers in China. But folks should be aware this is a very significant move by the Chinese government.
So I do want to underscore that, because we talk about China a lot, because China is a totalitarian government. They're always doing bad things. But as you mentioned, Bob Fu, who actually was a part of the initial protests back in the 80s and fled China and has come to the United States, and as you said, a senior fellow here, he puts an exclamation point on what is happening there, that this is unusual. I'm wondering, was the timing of this surrounding the distraction with the rest of the world looking on to the Middle East? Because China often takes advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, Tony, it very well could be, because the reports have said the initial raids were on October 10th. Bob says they started, I think, on October 9th, late in the day, certainly as the world's attention is focused on the events in the Middle East, the coming release and negotiation. So I don't think we'll know precisely at this point. Obviously, it's also possible that China is just concerned, the government's concerned about the growing influence of the church. I mean, Christianity, underground Christianity, China is, I think at the most conservative estimate, 60 million, some up to 100 million or more. That is very significant in terms of the impact those Christians could have, on China as a blessing to the country, but a threat to the Chinese Communist Party.
All right, we just have less than 2 minutes left. I want to switch gears to go to a domestic issue. And Casey, yesterday, California Democrat Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law AB 495, a very concerning piece of legislation that we've been tracking here at FRC. Give us a recap of this bill and why so many people are concerned.
Sure. So AB 495, it broadly expands basically the way in which your children can get taken away from you. I mean, that's kind of an extreme way of saying it, but that's how critics are characterizing it. And the stated intention of the bill is that if someone's parent, if 2 parents are being arrested by immigration enforcement or maybe deported, they want to make it easier for signing that child's custody over to a family member, or not even a family member sometimes. And so they remove almost all restrictions or verification needed to sign away a child to someone else. Now, the concern is that this is setting a really dangerous precedent for California officials or even a family member or family friend to sign over your custody of your child away from you for a whole host of reasons. Transgender care not being the least among them, in a state that is really pioneering taking kids away from parents for things like transgenderism, but not just that.
And many thought that he might not sign this to kind of portray himself as a little more moderate, but obviously his true colors coming through. By the way, this will be a focus this coming weekend at the Pray Vote Stand Summit in California, Southern California, at Calvary Chapel, Chino Hills. Folks, you can find out more, prayvotestand.org. Travis, Casey, out of time. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.